did to him, after all the things that I gave him back his life. I got him released from jail. How could he go off and forget? Joseph didn't do that. Joseph was looking for what God was doing in all of this. Joseph's primary question wasn't one of revenge. It was one of looking for that special action. How God's bigger plan was going to come into effect even through some of these difficult times, even through the trials. Another story for you. This one's for Rose. It's a story of a big Texan. Very rich, very powerful, and he loves to have parties. He loves to have parties around his very large pool that houses a 20-foot great white shark. And every night when he has these parties, he issues a challenge to all of the young men. He says, any one of you that can swim from one side to the other will get half of my fortune, or you can have the hand of my daughter in marriage. Now, you can imagine there weren't really any takers. You know, you see this great white shark swimming around in this pool. Nobody's too eager to kind of dive in. And then one night he's having a party. He issues the challenge, and just shortly later, he hears this splash, and he looks over, and this very strapping young man is in the water. And he's stroking his way to the other side as fast as he can. And just before the shark is ready to grab a hold of his leg, he makes it to the other side, pulls himself up on the deck. And out of wind, he stands there. Wow. The whole crowd there erupts in praise. And the large Texan comes over and he says, young man, half of my fortune is yours. And he says, I don't want it. Well, the good. He said, then you can have the hand of my daughter in marriage. He said, no, I don't want that either. He said, well, what is it that you want? I want the name of the guy that pushed me in the pool. Sure. That's where most of us are. Joseph kept an eye on the prize. And the prize was the glory of God. Now, in all of this upper story, we can imagine that the famine that struck Egypt and all of the surrounding area would have killed off this fledgling little nation called Israel. So how does God protect all of that? Well, I suppose he could have just made the famine not happen. That's probably where most of us would say, well, God, just snap your fingers and the famine won't happen. But that wasn't going to happen. Instead, God lets this play out down below, but as a safety net, he puts his brightest and best in the position that he needs him to be in order to handle the challenges. So he lets this righteous and strong and intelligent and handsome young man named Joseph be sold into slavery, be taken captive, be thrown into jail, be tempted by Potiphar's wife. Resist all of that, and finally get an audience with Pharaoh only to interpret his dreams. And the dreams are what save not only Egypt, but the surrounding world. And on top of that, it saves this fledgling nation called Israel, God's chosen. So God was taking care of all of the circumstances, but it certainly didn't look like that, did it? It just looked like Joseph was in trouble again. It simply looked like things were out of control. And so God once again has to step in and save Joseph. No. Joseph was part of God's plan of saving all of us. And he did. He made real Romans 8:28. For all things work together for good for those who love God. There are 4 things then that Joseph kind of teaches us. First of all, there's integrity. Joseph had integrity. He had a forgiving spirit. He had total trust in God, and he was always faithful to God's promises. Integrity. Probably the clearest example of that is when he is tempted by Potiphar's wife. She has her eyes on Joseph. She would like to have Joseph, but Joseph resists. Not once, not twice, not 3 times, but day after day after day after day after day. And finally, in order to escape her, he says to her, "How can I do such a wicked thing? Because this would not only sin against my master, but against God." His integrity was that he was always looking to do what God would have him to do. The integrity was that he would consider even going to jail rather than giving in to temptation that would keep him out. His integrity was that he was willing to do the difficult thing rather than the easy thing, even if it meant his life. Joseph would not betray his master. He would not betray his God. Why? Because he had integrity. He knew what the right thing was to do, and he always chose to do it. Do we? That's a hard thing to do, isn't it? When the difficult thing comes along and we see an easier solution that probably will keep us out of some of these troubles, we sometimes tend to migrate there, don't we? Is it because we don't want to do the God thing? I don't think so. I think it's because we don't want to suffer on the way to get there. Joseph said, no, integrity, that's important. What I do and why I do it and for whom I do it is important. He chose to have integrity by listening to God and doing the God thing no matter what the cost. Now, some scholars will say that if there is a clear example of a foreshadowing of Jesus in the Old Testament, it's Joseph. This kind of integrity, this kind of sacrificial love, this kind of sacrificial giving of himself for others. And we can see that in Joseph. Secondly, he had a forgiving spirit. Not every one of us could forgive their brothers for that. I am 50 plus years old, a senior, and I'm still working on forgiving my early 50-something brother of a few things that he did. And he me. Having a forgiving spirit isn't easy. I think if most of us were true to ourselves, if most of us could really look ourselves in the eye and be honest, we'd probably say, you know, when somebody wrongs me, what I really want is to get even. But not Joseph. Joseph was willing to forgive. And the only way that he could do that, it was because he always kept his eyes on what God was doing. He was looking for where God was leading. He knew that God was in charge. He never doubted that for a moment. And because of that, he could forgive the little things, like being sold into slavery. But in the scheme of things, that was little, wasn't it? Joseph being sold into slavery wouldn't have even made the history books if it weren't for Joseph's integrity and his forgiving spirit. So we can look back at all the incidents in Joseph's life and we can say, wow, what a man who suffered. Joseph would say, no, just a man trying to do what God wants me to do. Joseph kept his eye on the upper story, God's story.